I wanted to say a few words about Peter Hall, the founder and winemaker of Breaky Bottom, who sadly passed away last year. I thought we would dedicate this video to raising a glass to Peter Hall and talk a bit about the wonderful privilege that I had of being able to meet him a few times. It seemed like the most appropriate wine for this is the 2018 Sauvignon Blanc. This was the harvest that I helped out with at Breaky Bottom 2018 in October, and I was picking these particular grapes. I could probably show you a photo of me standing next to Peter with a bucket full of the grapes that went into this very wine, so it seemed like an appropriate wine to be sipping while reminiscing about lovely Peter Hall. Peter was not just a great winemaker and a pioneer of English wine, having established Breaky Bottom in Sussex in the South Downs in 1974, but he was also a real raconteur, a charming, funny, fascinating, and I hope he wouldn't have minded me saying it, somewhat eccentric man. Anyone who had the privilege of meeting Peter will probably say the same things about his wonderful rambling conversations where he'd flit from one topic to the next. He'd often talk about the colourful characters he knew throughout his life, and many of those have been remembered in the names of the wine he made. Each cuvée, there were normally 2 or 3 in a given vintage, would be given the name of either a personal friend, sometimes a family member, or in some cases an ancestor of Peter's who he had a particular fondness for, made some significant contribution to the world. Fascinating array of characters, and of course at the centre of all of them was Peter himself. I'm fortunate enough to have met Peter, I think a total of 4 times there at Breaky Bottom in the South Downs, and every single one of those visits was a magical experience. The name Breaky Bottom is a curious name, isn't it? For any of those of you who are not familiar with this naming convention of, I think this is all over England, but it's particularly prevalent in the South Downs. Bottoms are valleys or dips between the hills, and confusingly the hills are often called downs rather than ups. So it was just the name that pre-existed of this little farm that Peter discovered in, I think, 1974 or just before. It's a beautiful old building with that flint rubble surrounding the outside and an old barn that he later converted to a winery. I started to develop an interest in English sparkling wine in the 2010s, early 2010s, and started hearing rumblings about this magical place called Breaky Bottom. It wasn't an easy wine to find at that time in the 2010s, here in London at least. And I was really keen to try it, and also really keen to visit this place that I'd seen a few photos of and looked absolutely magical. I'd heard great things about the wine as well. So fast forward all the way to the summer of 2018, it was that hot summer which turned out to be a great vintage, a real breakthrough vintage for English wine. And I thought it would be fantastic to visit this special place, Breaky Bottom. I didn't know Peter at all at that time, we hadn't interacted before. I called the number on the website and it was a little bit like, it felt like a test, a phone interview almost, that first conversation with Peter. I was instantly fascinated by him, the little anecdotes he gave just in that very short phone conversation, and I did feel a bit as though I was being tested about the whether I was sufficiently interested enough to come and visit the vineyard. And I mentioned that I thought he was one of the pioneers, one of the real linchpins, the real founding fathers of English wine, and he seemed suitably flattered and extended an invitation. So a few weeks later I went along with some friends. I was actually already staying in Lewes at the time. I'd been in Lewes the night before. I'd been walking the South Downs Way, a stretch of the South Downs Way from Eastbourne to Lewes, and that incredibly hot summer, temperatures in excess of 30 degrees C. Met my friends at Lewes Station and we got the train down to South Ease and then walked the rest of the way. It is an incredibly remote place, Breaky Bottom. The nearest station is South Ease, but it's still several miles walk from there. And the farm itself is not on the actual road network. You approach it down a long, very stony, very uneven track. But considering that we arrived as complete strangers to Peter, We didn't know him, he didn't know us, my friends and I. His hospitality from the outset was absolutely wonderful. He was so welcoming, friendly, charming and funny. And I think we were there for a good 3 hours. He was incredibly generous with his time, I thought, considering a busy winemaker, viticulturist, also running a small farm. I'm sure he had many other things to do. It was incredibly generous of him to spend so long with us. We did a tasting of many of his recent wines at that time, went through them all one by one. And I was instantly spellbound with how vivacious, how lively, bold acidity and zing of these wines. They really were very breathtaking. So it was magical to spend a few hours in Peter's back garden doing a very slow, leisurely tasting of at least 6 different wines, I think it was, and just enjoy that magical surrounding, a tour of the vineyard. Peter would often stop mid-sentence because a bird was flying overhead and he would make cooing noises to the bird. He would talk to the birds. He was really embedded in that countryside there. He was an absolute fixture of that beautiful piece of land. And I think he rarely left, and you can't really blame him. It felt like a slice of heaven to me, Breaky Bottom. Magical vineyard in that beautiful valley in the beautiful South Downs. I returned later that year, October 2018. The vineyard usually relies on volunteers to harvest the grapes. And that was another magical experience. It was very different, certainly not wonderful summery weather. It was pretty grey and misty, wet on and off throughout the day. 4 hours I did in the morning of picking grapes, and it's actually quite physical manual labour, but a fascinating experience. I loved all the funny little quirks. I've probably mentioned before, they had signs with the buckets saying, please be very careful with the snippers, the little sort of secateur like things used for cutting the bunches of grapes off, because we're making white wine, not red wine. And I think at least one person did manage to cut part of their finger off, and there was just blood everywhere. It was quite dramatic. But it was a fantastic experience. I think I probably said before, the chatting to the other grape pickers, this old phrase of I heard it through the grapevine, very literal. They got us to pick in pairs, so we were facing each other, and we could talk to somebody else while we were picking, so it didn't get too repetitive and tedious. Met some really interesting people, clearly a lot of people with huge affection for the vineyard, which was great to see for Peter and for the wine and for that magical place. I stayed for the lunch as well, some really nice, I think it was Mexican food, oddly enough, really nice lunch. Peter was obviously very busy on the day because he was orchestrating this really critical part of the whole year, really. It's one of the most important days of the year, surely. But he still made a little bit of time to come to talk to everybody. We had a few chats I think throughout the day. I've got some lovely pictures. One of my favourite pictures, me just looking, sort of grinning from ear to ear because I was so happy to be there, standing next to Peter, both of us with buckets full of grapes, crates and buckets full of grapes, and here is the end result. It's such a wonderful feeling to be able to drink that wine that on that misty, drizzly day in October 2018 I was picking the grapes of. I returned the following year in the summer of 2019. I think Peter had gotten into a pattern of releasing the new vintages in roughly the summer, May or June of each year. So I was keen to get down there for another tasting as soon as the newest vintages had just been released. So in July of 2019, he just released the 2014 vintages because they all have usually 3 or more years of lees aging. So that was very exciting to taste these new wines. I particularly love the Michel Moreau, still a favourite of mine from 2014, the Pinot and Chardonnay blend from that year. It was particularly special to me because I took my daughter along that time, my daughter and my wife. My daughter is very much a city girl. She would have been only 7 years old then. It was quite often difficult, probably still is now, to drag her out to the countryside for a walk. But I think even she understood a bit of the magic of this place. The weather was very changeable that day. I think it rained on and off quite heavily at times. So we'd sort of have to, we'd spent a bit of time outside of the vineyard, but as soon as the rain really set in, we'd retreat inside, sat there in Peter's kitchen tasting the wines. I think my daughter really understood, even though obviously she was far too young to enjoy the wine, but I think she understood something of the magic of the place that I'd been banging on about already for a year and a bit. And I think she understood something about the wonderful charm of Peter. It felt like visiting family on that occasion particularly. I had my family with me, but it felt as though not just a cold clinical winery tour or vineyard tour. It was more like going to visit a dear old friend or a relative. I'd hoped to continue that what was becoming an annual tradition of visiting Peter in summer or whenever the new releases came out to taste them at the vineyard every year. But of course 2020 and 2021 had its own plans, so that wasn't really possible for those 2 years. But we did keep in touch. We frequently corresponded throughout that time, emails back and forth, even phone calls sometimes. Peter would occasionally call just to see how I was doing, which I thought was lovely for, for somebody who was just a customer almost, but he felt more like a friend. So that was really, really touching that he would occasionally just call and see how it was. We talked about anything and everything in those emails and those phone conversations. Not often wine, actually. Occasionally a little bit about the trials and tribulations of the English wine industry, but more often than not, we'd end up talking about anything and everything, from astronomy to literature. We had a lovely exchange about Hilaire Belloc, who's of course a man of Sussex, and it turned out his father had a particular interest in Hilaire Belloc, a literary interest. So those were wonderful interactions, really treasured correspondence. In the summer of 2022, with life returning to normal, I was able to make one more visit to Breaky Bottom and to see Peter. Unfittingly or appropriately, it was with many of the same friends that I'd been to see Peter with in that first visit, during that first visit of 2018. And it was similar weather, perhaps not quite as hot, but it was a lovely summer's day. We once again walked through that magical landscape of the South Downs to get to Breaky Bottom, and we were regaled and entertained with anecdotes and stories, jokes and horseplay from Peter for a few hours that afternoon. Tasted the most recent vintages, revisited some old favourites, and had an absolutely magical time again. It was really very special. It was clear that the intervening few years had taken their toll on Peter a bit, but then they had on all of us. We'd all grown a bit older during that period of time. But I really had the sense that he would just go on forever. He was accepting a little bit more help, I think, by that time in the vineyard, but really showed no signs of stopping altogether or retiring. The summer of 2022 ended up being the last time that I saw Peter in person. Once again, a year later, the summer of 2023, I'd hoped to get there in order to continue this wonderful annual tradition, tasting the new releases, spending a wonderful afternoon with Peter again. But I think both he and his wife, Christina, had had some ill health that year, and it really felt like it would be just too much of an imposition to lean on his very generous hospitality. So we didn't go that year, and the situation had just deteriorated again. I think by the following year, he and his wife were not hugely well. But he was carrying on with the vineyard. As far as I understand, was still really quite heavily involved until 2025. I believe he passed away in October 2025. So he just kept going, really, until more or less the end. We did keep in touch, though, through those last few years. We kept exchanging emails from time to time, back and forth. And I loved that whenever I put in an order, he would include a little handwritten note. And the last of those I think I would have received from him was February 2025. Slightly earlier than usual, they had released some new vintages, the new vintage, which would have been 2019, I believe. And I'm really proud, really honoured. I don't know if this was just the luck of the draw, but I actually have bottle number 1 of the Cuvée Mangescot, the Pinot and Chardonnay blend from the 2019 vintage. So that's quite a prized possession of mine, the bottle number 1 from the run of 6,000 or however many it was of the 2019 Pinot and Chardonnay blend. So Peter will be very much missed. It is sad to think that there won't be another opportunity to enjoy one of those magical afternoons in Peter's back garden, wandering the vineyard, sitting there enjoying the wines and talking about a bit about wine. We usually would talk a bit about wine, but generally the conversation would just roam over anything and everything. And it was always a joy. Peter was such a raconteur. You don't meet many people like this anymore, such an engaging storyteller. But at the same time, wasn't sitting there just delivering a monologue. He was actually interested in other people. He would ask about me and about my friends and what was going on in our lives, and he included us all in the conversation. So it was a magical time. It was so enthralling, so entertaining, so fun spending time with Peter. Very sad that we won't have an opportunity to do that again, but we can remember him through his magical wines. And I think the silver lining to this cloud is that it seems for the time being the business will continue. There is a message on their website, and I believe between the family and some of the employees who've been running the business, I've been chatting on and off to Louisa, who I think had run a lot of the business side of things, and possibly even works in the vineyard as well for some number of years before Peter passed away, and she seems to be very front and centre of keeping things going, which is great. So at least for the short term, the wine is still very much available. I believe the vineyard is still being tended to, and we can still enjoy these magical wines, which, you know, now, as I said in an email to Louisa, are it's like having a drink with an old friend. I always thought of Breaky Bottom as a kind of magic potion. Peter is often described as a wizardly figure, I think because of his slightly reclusive life there in Breaky Bottom, because of that incredible wisdom of 50 plus years of producing English wine, because of his slightly eccentric character. Again, I hope he wouldn't have minded me describing him that way. I mean, all of this with deep affection. So he was often characterised as a sort of a wizardly figure, and Breaky Bottom, these wines they are magic potions. They are teleportation devices. A glass of this transports me to that wonderful vineyard, that wonderful landscape. It captures that magical place in a bottle, and it's a wonderful way to remember Peter and continue his legacy, to enjoy a glass of this fantastic stuff. There's an amazing back catalogue of previous vintages still available. Some of the very early vintages, the 2009, 2010, on limited allocation, with prices I think completely justifiably raised accordingly, but there's still very good supply of the recently released vintages, the 2019, the 2018, which would have been an abundant year, and a few before that. So I heartily recommend, don't be shy, go and reacquaint yourself with the magic that is Breaky Bottom. Raise a glass to Peter Hall, who will be much missed. Cheers.